Hoping everyone can hear and see. So starting week 6A of mobile development for Android, CSC 330. Hopefully we're recording and hopefully we're doing the conference right. I think everything's set up. So we start off each week with a Agile startup, and again, since everybody is pretty much online, please email me your stand-up report and reflect it as of today, kind of where you feel you're in the class and anything blocking you, things about the final assignment, things about the projects. Just let me know what's going on, and you'll get credit for the stand-up. On the calendar, so we actually had Project 4 due on Sunday, and we also had a Milestone 3. We'll talk about those in a second, also due on Sunday. We're kind of closing in on the class. This is Tuesday, the 27th of November, and we got 2 discussions left, and we'll talk about those in a second as well. But looking ahead towards December, doesn't give us a lot of time. We got 2 more weeks, full weeks. We have a Project 5 that's due on Sunday, and the final project is going to be due on that Thursday. I'll give you guys a heads up. I'm going to be out on Saturday, the 15th, and expect to have grading done by then. So hopefully everybody can kind of get things wrapped up and submitted, and get the final grades done that Friday. I think the class technically ends the following Tuesday, the 18th, but there's really not anything planned in this class for those remaining few days. All right. So on the discussion, I know we don't have a lot of people in the class, so I'm being flexible in the grading, obviously. So as long as you post a reasonable original post, I'll give you full credit. But just stay on topic and sort of think about the subject a little bit, and we'll talk about these. The graphical layout tool is discussion 9.1. I think it's pretty impressive, and we'll talk about that more today as I kind of go through the lecture on it. It really allows you to visually design layouts for activities and fragments. It provides a worthy alternative to hand editing the layout resource file. That being said, sometimes it's a great tool, but sometimes you just need to kind of actually go into that resource file and make the changes, typing them in, as opposed to just sort of assuming that the tool is going to do everything for you. So kind of keep that balance in mind. But with this tool, you can preview the layout in both the design blueprint mode and add many widgets from a palette, orient the preview in landscape or portrait, change the simulated device and Android build, and even show translations. So pretty powerful stuff. But what I'm kind of asking you to do here is just be critical. What you like and don't like about it. Do you feel more comfortable editing the layout in a text or layout view? And what problems features would you add to make it more useful? What problems have you had using it to design your own app's layout? So, Android Studio is a pretty fast-moving IDE, and sometimes they release stuff that maybe needs to be tested a little bit better or flushed out. Is the design kind of what you think? Is it intuitive? The icons even, be critical of it. Just because it's out there and people are using it doesn't mean it's the best thing since sliced bread. So you see what you come up with and see what bothers you about it. And again, here's a screenshot of it with both the blueprint view and the regular view, and the palette here, and component tree. Some of these icons and controls up here. I never really liked the plus and minus for the zoom in. I always like just sort of a simple slider. I don't know. Just sort of your gut reaction on a lot of this stuff. The other is discussion 10.1, design patterns, and I've talked about the singleton design pattern described in chapter 8 in the textbook. Very common programming technique. In fact, we talk about this in game programming a lot. Basically, you implement a class that's only allowed for one instance of that class to be created, and in fact, it's generally a static member of the class. There's several variations how you can implement it. The most common way is to create a static class variable that's the same type as the class itself. And when that variable is first accessed, if the value is null, then the object for that class is created and assigned to the variable. And here's some sample code on how to do that. This is C#. It may be this probably works in Java as well. Many other design patterns commonly used here and here. So you follow the links. I think these are just general design pattern links. Let's see what we come up with. Yeah, so this one's general one. You can actually find Java versions of some of these. Singleton, obviously, factory, the builder, prototype, an object pool, how to do a command and interpreter. These are sort of similar to pseudocode, but more with classes and what they call UML, Unified Modeling Language, diagrams, relationships, and a vocabulary of terms which are common to describe the pattern. So it's kind of translating a lot of these patterns into the problem set that you're trying to solve. So that's part of the problem is you sort of have to look at each class and say, hey, how does this translate to my problem set? The other one here, let's see what this link is. This is the Wikipedia link. If you do a little searching again, you'll find Java versions. This is a very popular Gang of Four book for people probably in the 1990s that came up with some of these patterns, and especially in computer science history as a guide, that this is still relevant and popular today, so it does make a lot of sense. Discuss what patterns seem most useful and how the patterns are organized. Find about the Gang of Four. Yeah, it's that book, but see what you find out about it with respect to design patterns, and have a discussion about that. The organization of patterns is also sort of interesting. They're not all kind of grouped together. There's some rhyme and reason about how they organize the patterns as they discuss them. Okay, so let's go through some of the assignments, because I know a lot of people are sort of behind and understood that, wherever you are, I'm going to be a little flexible in this class to kind of get the work done. But, if you want to get, credit for this class, you need to kind of tell me about your personal schedules and where you want to, where you see yourself going in the next couple of weeks to get things wrapped up. So there's kind of like two threads here. One is the final project and the other are the individual projects. The final project is kind of developing your own app, and that involves the brainstorming stage, which we've talked about quite some time, what kind of app you want to build. And then I need a text file with two well thought out ideas, and then comparing those two ideas. The interface was due a couple of weeks ago, but basically a visual representation. We call that a wireframe of the UI. Do these by hand, or there's various tools for creating them. One diagram for each screen of the app. Show the widgets you'll be placing, arrows. Show how the screens kind of get linked together, how do you go back and forth between them. And again, this is sort of abstract. You really don't need to worry too much about the look and feel or the colors, but rather just sort of how it's going to function. And this is sort of the key part. You want them detailed enough you can give them to another student. And granted, we don't have a lot of students in this class, but maybe another friend who's enrolled here or some colleagues. Basically, you want to present them with the wireframes and get some critical feedback. What you're missing, what you got right, how you might change things, is the way you laid out the controls the best way, things you might want to add that aren't that much work but really sort of bring the point home about what this app or what this particular screen in the app is supposed to be doing. Just get some real critical feedback and see how that kind of changes your design a little bit, because it's the process of actually reviewing it with somebody and explaining it and talking it out really helps you better understand what you're building, and the feedback just makes it that much better. Share your feedback. I kind of want to see what the feedback is. If you have some kind of paragraph or something from that other person, that would be great to include here as well. And submit the wireframe short paragraph describing the feedback and any action that you've taken upon it. So what I kind of want to hear is a little bit about, well, this person said this about it, it wasn't clear, or you know, these controls were jumbled, and I wanted to, you know, maybe break it into another screen or something. All those actions, I kind of want to hear what the process was. And these are just some apps for doing the wireframes, and we've talked about those in a while. So that was due like 11/11. 11/25 on the project final project. I kind of wanted to see some work in progress, a working version of your app. Maybe you've sort of blocked out all the screens and you can kind of navigate between them, but you don't have all the controls in there. But somewhere along the line, this app should resemble your final app, both in the way it runs and the way you're going to be designing the software. And again, you can use placeholder widgets, stubbed out source code, and other in-progress techniques to present an app that can be run. Hence, the app at this milestone needs to build successfully and run in the emulator. And then submit a zip file with some screenshots showing your app running either emulator on device and the updated wireframes based on your app development. So in other words, those wireframes, you know, as you kind of develop, if you're making changes, I like to see what those changes are. Okay, so on the other thread of the class is just the regular projects, and you know, project 2, project 1 was a basic Android app. The project 2 is an upgraded Android app. And again, you know, I know some of you haven't got the textbook yet, and unfortunately, that's kind of a critical piece of this class, is be able to kind of read through that and see what's going on. So, you know, if you look at the second chapter, there's a geo quiz and sort of expanding on that app, doing a few additional stuff. But the second chapter talks about that model view controller model. We've talked about that in lecture here. Storing the data model class, the getters and setters, having 2 linear layouts, horizontal and vertical in the layout, a text view in the layout, next and previous buttons, and be able to handle those, an icon for at least one of the buttons. And then run it on an actual Android device, not the emulator. And again, we do have one in the library, or if you have a friend or your own Android device, that's great too. Project 3 was the Lifecycle app, and this was sort of based on the third chapter. So what you want to do is sort of log the life cycle changes in your activity: the on start, on create, on resume, on pause, on stop, on destroy. And basically just kind of log out messages there. You want to be able to view the messages in Logcat, use the filtering to show the messages, develop a landscape layout in addition to the portrait. So this is kind of creating a second layout. And then try, you know, running your app and rotating the device, and see if you can figure out how to save the data between rotation by storing and loading the data from a bundle. And again, you know, once you get that geo quiz and you're able to kind of go through that third chapter, this will make full sense on what to do. A couple of additional things: just add your name and class number, or text view in the UI. You want to add some additional log statements, making sure you use all 5 log levels. So these don't quite make sense, other than just sort of make sure you try all 5 versions and see how they look. I think they're color-coded in Logcat. Display a toast with the percentage score based on some steps taken in your app, and those could be answering quiz questions or however you want to model it. But to sort of display a toast that shows sort of some kind of progress or a result. You want to be able to log a stack trace with the new exception method that's talked about in Chapter 4. And try running Android lint on your entire project, also talked about in Chapter 4. We kind of went through that in a lecture, and see how surprised you are of how many things it kind of finds. Run Android Profiler on the device or emulator with your app not running. With your app running, and kind of see what kind of graphs, CPU graphs you get there. So that was Project 3. And Project 4, which was due on Sunday, is the multiple activities. And this kind of maps out to Chapter 5 in the textbook. And you know, what you're doing here is creating an app with multiple activities. Each activity should be done in a separate activity class, separate layouts, modifying the manifest to include both activities, starting an activity using Start Activity API. Then you have to create this intent. We talked about intents in the lecture. be able to pass some data, integer or Boolean values, use intent extras. Second activity should display a message based on the data value. Second activity should return a result back to the first activity using the intent. And the first activity should display a message board based on the returned result. Again, it sounds pretty complicated, but again, once you're in the textbook looking at chapter 5, this will make total sense on how this needs to be coded. A few additional requirements: show your name and class number in one of the layouts, show the build version on one of the layouts, and show that the app can be run on either an emulator or device, and then sending in some screenshots and sending in a zip file containing the project. Project is stored in Android Studio projects in your computer's home folder. Hopefully, that makes sense at this point where your projects are being stored. Give me 1 second here. Let's see if anybody's signed on. Hey guys, coming up for air here. Hopefully audio is okay. All right, good. Yeah, I'm pretty much going through the previous assignments and just sort of reviewing those. Hopefully makes some sense, and yeah. Okay. So Project 5, this one actually is due next Sunday. So this one's equivalent to Chapter 7 in the textbook, and this is the criminal intent activity. This one involves using UI fragments in the Fragment Manager. This, I think, is like the hardest of the assignments, just because the fragments is sort of a different path to take. It's probably, if you were in industry creating a new app, you'd probably want to go a fragment path on developing the UI. But for right now, it's sort of we're kind of saving it for the end. When you do your final projects, it's up to you if you want to use fragments or not. It really depends on how much additional work you think it's going to save you or cause you. But at least, if you get through this Project 5, you'll see what those are all about. So it's really creating a second an activity that extends app compatibility activity, and then adding a frame layout container for this activity's layout. Creating a UI fragment that's going to be hosted in the activities code, and this goes through all the steps, composing a separate layout file which contains various widgets, a button, text view, edit text, and checkbooks, creating a new class that extends from fragment. It uses that layout file, then wiring up the widgets, and using the fragment manager to host the fragment and have the activity host the fragment. So and then show your name and class in the layout. Again, this one, like all the assignments, you go through the book, look at Chapter 7, work through it. You should be able to duplicate the same strategy to kind of create your own UI fragment app. So, just kind of, need to put the time into really read the chapter and understand it. All right. So I do want to talk about the layout editor. I know I was actually in there today with Yasmin a little bit, kind of looking at it, and kind of went through some stuff this morning. So it's sort of fresh in my mind. On paper, I think it's really a powerful, useful editing system. It's just it might be a little buggy. I don't know if it was the machine we were on today. I didn't have too much trouble on my desktop at home, but you really, at least it gives you the sort of this text and design sort of control down here. So if the layout editor causes you trouble, you could always go into a text mode and type in what you think you need for the layout. But let's go through it a little bit. So the benefits, why use a layout editor? Well, the theory is you can quickly build layouts by dragging UI elements into place. Definitely quicker than typing them in. The visual editor versus hand editing layout files, that needs to save you some time if you could just visually kind of put things in place or make changes. You're able to preview on different size Android devices fairly easily. And we'll show that in a second. And dynamically resize the layout to make sure it works on different screen sizes. So This is from the Android developer site, but I thought it was kind of a good slide here to kind of just walk you through the interface. So anytime you sort of have a layout file selected, you'll have this layout editor kind of exposed on the right side of Android Studio. So this first section up here is the palette, and I think we had a discussion on that. The different types of, they call these things views, the different views that you can throw into your UI. And they're organized in these categories on the left side. Common is sort of frequently used ones that you've used or things that it thinks are common. Text, buttons, widgets, layouts, containers, Google, legacy. So those are the way they organize these views. Then there's number 2, the component tree. And this is sort of a hierarchy of the different elements in your layout. And the root of that thing is constraint layout. So just kind of make sure that whatever you have on here, the name may not say constraint, but make sure it is a constraint layout, because that's what we'll be showing here. This one here, for example, has 3 text views. I guess aspect ratio, big Android icon, text view. Has an image view, which is probably this guy right here, and then the image button, this guy over here. So here you can again see the blueprint mode, which is just sort of a it's sort of similar to this view, except it sort of just shows the outlines, doesn't show any details. You know, it has this little mound here for the image view, but it doesn't really go into detail. The text are sort of blocked out here, and then it has all these like squiggly lines that show the constraints, and also the margins between different elements, different views. All right, so the other thing in the layout editor is the toolbar on top, and we'll go through this a little bit here, but you have these 6 different settings. Number 1 allows you to toggle between design, blueprint, or both of them. So again, you know, if you look back here, this is design over here, and this is the blueprint over here, and you can have one or both or either one. So the design real-world preview, and the blueprint only outlines for each view. Number 2, screen orientation. So very easy to switch between landscape and portrait with this button right here. Device type and size. So drop down here, all the different Android devices and their you know, pixel resolutions. You can kind of, or aspect ratios. You can kind of get those by dropping down here and selecting one. The API version that you'll be running on. The app theme and UI, we'll talk about those in a future lecture. Just kind of way of theming different controls so they sort of look similar. And then the language. You could select which language you want to display your interface in. And that needs to kind of map to different languages that you have defined in a language file. And we'll talk to that in a future lecture. There's some additional ones in the toolbar. I know that I pulled this from the Android Studio site, developer site, but there's a few additional ones. You have these buttons here for the scroll, how big you want the layout to look. So, you know, decrease it, increase it. This thing here I think is scale to fit. Let's see, zoom controls, zoom to fit. So this will fill up whatever area you have. And then you get this little warning and errors if you want to see those or not. You can toggle those on and off. All right, on the palette, list of views and view groups organized in categories. The common, most frequently used. You could also add your favorites in there. So if you have a favorite, you know, view or something, you could throw that into the common. Search up here, you know, if you know you need sort of an image, something, you just type it in here and it will find it for you. And then once you find the control you want, the notion is you sort of take this here and you drag it into the design editor. So we got the design editor here. Here's the toolbar. Let me do one thing here. I haven't started Android Studio, so let me start that guy up. How am I sounding? Good? You guys all comfy, eating some good food and drinking some beers when you're listening to this? Yeah, I thought not. Okay, I'm launching Android Studio here. Yeah. We'll do some drinks when the class is over. How about that? I did start it, didn't I? Maybe not. Ah, there it is. All right, I did start it. Okay. Right. So again, let's pick our layout file here. Under resources, layout, let's look at this guy here. All right, so I got a linear layout here. I had a little trouble with the conversion tool earlier, so let's go ahead and create a new layout here just to play around with. Let's see, layout resource file. We'll call this test. And the root element is going to be a constraint layout. It's kind of interesting the way that's default now. Okay, so let's go ahead and create that guy. And here we have a constraint layout. And again, our blueprint and regular design mode here. So, you know, if you want to do like a text view and just sort of drag it in, there it goes. Right there. We could zoom up here a little bit. Now, if you notice, when you first drag stuff in here, there's no constraints. So if we run an app with this, I don't want to really run here, but if I ran, this thing would go right to the top corner because there's nothing constraining in place. And by constraining it, you mean this guy has 4 sides, top, bottom, left, and right. You want to make sure these are sort of linked somewhere. Linked to the side, or linked to the top and bottom, or to another control, another view. All right, let's go back to the notes here for a second. So we got the toolbar on top, and then we have the design and the blueprint mode. And here's our toolbar right here. So let's go through these things. This guy over here, the first one, is sort of, you know, what do you want to view? Do you want to show you constraints? Do you want to show the margins? Do you want to fade unselected views here? So let's see. Let's create a second, drag a second view in here. This will be a bun. And let's see. So I have this guy selected. And if I turn on fade unselected views, this guy should fade. Let's see. A little hard to tell the difference, but that's what it's supposed to do. Show constraints and show margins. We'll keep those on for now. Okay, so the next one here is the toggle auto connect. So let's go ahead and turn this on, and then we're going to drag a view in here. Let's do maybe an image view. How about that? Put one down here. We don't know what the image is going to be yet. It's going to ask me as soon as I drag it in place. Let's find one from the project. How about the launcher guy? Yeah, remember that one? All right, let's put it in there. So this should have linked it in place. And why is that not working? turn off, turn on, turn off. Let me try one more. It's on. If I put a button in here, it should automatically link, and I don't know why it's not doing that. All right, maybe I don't have the latest IDE I did at home, but I know once you drag it in here, it should constrain to all four sides. It'll figure out the best way of constraining it. This is your margin. Right here, if you pull that, you can have 8, 16 powers of 24. So let's see. So if I'm going to constrain this guy right here, see it's going to give me 24 units on that side. I'm going to constrain to this side here. It's going to be 24 as well. And this is sort of a flexible distance here. This clears all constraints. So remember we constrained this guy right here. If I hold this and press this guy, I'm going to lose my constraints. Well, that works good. Okay. Likewise, if I constrain here, I constrain maybe to... should be able to constrain there. Let's see. Is it because it's disabled? No? Should, oh, fade unselected. Let's take that off. Text view should have one. I should be able to constrain here and here. Here we go. Okay. So I got the constraint. So this guy's constrained in all sides. If I press this guy, poof, all those are gone. Okay, infer constraints. This is sort of interesting. So this one here, I'm going to put right like that. Let's press the infer, see what it comes up with. Ah, so it says my top is to the top, my left is to the side. This guy here looks like it's constrained to the top level of this text view here. And this guy here on the right side is going to be constrained to my left margin here. So that means if I move this guy, this should have moved with it. That's always so funky. All right. Expand horizontally, expand vertically. So what that means is all your space that you have in the constraints, it's going to take over that. So it's going to expand the size. Let's see, vertically. Let's see, vertically and parent. I'm not quite sure what it's doing. The vertical made sense, but the horizontal doesn't. Okay, not really sure exactly how that works. Let's see, again, horizontally, vertically. Horizontally. Maybe it takes into account margins and just sort of balances it in there. All right, and the last one is sort of these vertical and horizontal guidelines, vertical barriers, horizontal barriers, and groups. And we'll talk about those as we go through. But we can do something like this. Let's create a horizontal guideline. So what it does is it adds one here. Let me go ahead and select it. And it shows it being 20 units from the top. This is what we had trouble with earlier. You should be able to change the kind of guideline it is. So here's our guideline. It doesn't say if it's horizontal or vertical. You can change the size of it. These guys won't appear in... Oh, there it goes. That's weird. Okay, so as soon as you press it, it changes. So here it's kind of 210 to the top. Now it's 357 to the bottom. And now it's a percentage that you can change somehow. Do I slide this? Yeah, it's really funky. You know, this doesn't seem like it's working very well. But it is a line here. So what you can do, let's put the line here. And let's say I want this button to kind of align with it. So if it hits red, I take off that constraint. But now I say I want to constrain this to the line. And I have a margin in here, so it's going to be aligned to that guideline. And I assume if I change the guideline, that this thing is going to sort of be constrained along with it. So that's how the guidelines work. The barriers are similar to guidelines, except the barrier is defined by a group of views. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so on this guy here, which is the infer constraints, instead of adding constraints to every view as you place them in the layout, you can move each view into positions you desire, then click infer constraints to automatically create the constraints. So this has a lot of brain power behind it to figure all this stuff out, but infer constraints scans the layout to determine the most effective set of constraints for all views, and makes the best effort to constrain the views to their current positions while allowing flexibility. You might need to make some adjustments to make sure the layout responds as you intend for different screen sizes. So again, we kind of showed that. But let's go ahead and let me select this guy. Let me remove the constraints. Let's move this guy right here, and then let's infer. So it kind of infers that this is to the top and that's to the right. It really didn't do anything here, which is interesting. So it doesn't assume that I'm constrained at all on the right side or on the bottom. So it only constrained me to the top and to the bottom. I'm sorry, to the top and to the left. But if let's kind of remove those again, and let's put this guy right here, kind of close to the margin. Let's see what it does. So here it constrained me to the top and to the right, and then it kind of added another third constraint to the bottom. Interesting. All right, then the auto connect. When turned on, it automatically creates 2 or more constraints for each view as you add them to the layout, but only when appropriate to constrain the view to the parent layout. Auto connect does not create constraints to other views in the layout. Okay, so let's try this one more time. So here's our text view. I'm going to add a text view in here. I'm going to put it right in the corner. Come on. Oh wait, did I do that wrong? No. Let's do that with a button. Let me add a button in here. Let me put it in the corner. It just, oh wait, I didn't have it turned on. No, I do. That's what's weird. That thing is just not working for me. All right. All right, so just in general on the constraint layouts, we've done linear and we've done relative. Constraint is sort of the recommendation from Android Studio and the developer site. The big advantage is you could build these really large and complex layouts with a very flat hierarchy. So this guy right here, there's a lot of connections in here that are being done, but the layout is fairly flat. There's not a lot of parenting here. Things kind of know where they need to go, and that's the advantage of the constraint layout. It looks simple here, but under the covers it's fairly complex. In fact, if you go here to the text view here, you can kind of see these layouts, the constraints on how they're programmed into the XML. And it really isn't that hard to kind of look at the top, bottom, left, rights, and then kind of say, oh, I see what the syntax is here, and maybe just add them in. And maybe this could be easier than actually going through using the layout editor. So let's see, bottom to top, end to end, top to bottom. You could probably reverse engineer some of the syntax here and just sort of add them and see if that works for you. More flexible than a relative layout, that's true. And easier to use with Android Studio Design Editor. Well, I'm finding some bugs here, but hopefully. The other thing it offers is if you right-click on your layout, your layout view here, linear layout in this example here, you get this option to convert it to a constraint layout. And it will convert it. You got to make sure you rename it. That's the other thing we kind of caught here. But that's it's pretty easy to kind of convert one to the other. And hopefully once you convert it, everything that you have defined here remains constrained. So again, here's the constraint layout. The one thing I kind of stumbled on that kind of confused me for a second is this guy. Let's see where we are. Let's go back to the design view here. This guy right here, this guy here says view all attributes. So in this mode here, I'm just viewing sort of the layout width, some stuff about the buttons, but not all the attributes. But this icon here kind of toggles me into this full list where I see everything. I lose that graphic. I like this graphic here that kind of shows what the width and height are. But in any way, this is sort of a toggle here, so you can go back and forth. All right. So yeah, just that icon there kind of threw me for why this was missing. This is kind of interesting too, because it shows you sort of, we'll get to this in a second. So after dropping in a view, you want to adjust both the horizontal and vertical constraints. You connect these markers on each side to the parent side or other views. So in other words, you drop this guy in, you have these circles, these markers, and you need to drag these to constrain them to either sides or different views. So this here is a little confusing, but you have these different graphics inside. You can have these straight lines here. You can have these, I think they call them chevrons that kind of show in here, or the squiggly lines. So this is pretty much the layout width, layout height, and the settings here could be wrap content. You can actually give a physical dimension, size, to match the constraint, or there's another version in here where you kind of can pick this little triangle here and set the aspect ratio of what your view is going to be. So the notion is whenever these are straight, that means your layout width is a fixed dimension. If you have these chevron things here, that means you want to wrap the content, and you have these squiggly lines, that means you're going to match the constraint. So it's different ways of sizing your view. The other thing is this bias, and this is a way of adjusting the constraint which would otherwise be balanced. So in other words, let's take a look at this guy right here. Whoops, what did I do? Go back to design. So what we're saying here is there's a bias on this guy. So it could be biased this way or biased this way. So if I bias up here, it's going to align with the top, hopefully. Come on. Did I do that right? If I line down here, it's going to align with the bottom. Let's do this. Let's go ahead and create a new layout here. Let me just drag in a button here. It's constrained to the top, to the bottom, to the left, to the right. And if I select it, I have these two bias things. So if I bias at 50%, let me go back up to 0. Let's scale this down a little bit. So here, 0, 24 is the margin, so that's probably what this is. If I go down here, it goes to the bottom, bias this way, and bias this way. So it's really a way of splitting what otherwise would be an equal constraint. Now I can't move this. Why can't I move it? There we go. Move that back to 50. I can type those in. 49, 50. A little tough to hit. All right. Okay. So again, it's just if this only works, I think, if your constraints sort of equal on both sides, and then you get these bias bars. And the same example here, almost identical example. Okay. This is another view on the constraint layout, the graphic on top here. So you have the ID of your view. Number 1 is the size ratio. Number 2 is a way of deleting. Oh, I didn't notice that. Okay, so let's see if that works. So right now I have it constrained on the left side. If I toggle this guy, oh, I get a little X here. So let's see, hit that. There's no more constraint on the left side, so only 3 sides constrained. That's interesting. Okay. Number 4 is the margin. So again, my margins here, I can change my margin if I want, make it 8, make it 0. So now it's constrained 0. So if I go 0, 50% is going to be right there, but otherwise the margin's on top there. So keep in mind, this margin is sort of what reality is for that control. This margin here is when you first create it. So you can, this is where it first gets set to, and then you can override it here. And then the constraint bias, we showed those little circles here in the bars. I do have a video. If you don't mind, we're going to watch the video. You guys still with me? All right, let's see if the video plays. I had some trouble last time, but let's see if we can figure that out.
If you have been watching my videos, you know that the first thing I usually do when preparing the layout is to change this constraint layout into a relative layout or a linear layout. Now these are easier to use for tutorials, but if you build a real app, you should really consider using the constraint layout instead. The constraint layout was introduced in 2016, and the idea behind it is to create a view hierarchy as flat as possible. Usually when we build a layout, we put views like text views into layouts like linear layouts, and then we often put these layouts into other layouts. And then we end up with a really deep view hierarchy. And such a deep nested view hierarchy is not good performance-wise. And the idea behind the constraint layout is to flatten this view hierarchy so we basically only have one level below our constraint layout. And the constraint layout is basically a more flexible version of the relative layout, with more features, a flatter view hierarchy, and it can pretty much be created with drag and drop only, so you don't have to write XML code if you don't want to, and can instead do everything through this editor here. So in this video we want to take a look at the basics of the constraint layout, see how everything works, and in the next videos we will then look at more advanced features, because this layout really has a lot to offer. Now at the moment we still have our relative layout here because I changed this, and now I want to show you the first feature. When we right click on this, we can convert this into a relative layout. Now we get this message here where we can make some changes. You can read that when you try it yourself. Go ahead and click OK, and now it changed our relative layout into a constraint layout. And this text view now has these 4 constraints. For some reason it adds this relative layout ID. We can go ahead and delete this. And first let's take a look at this menu here at the top. So here we can switch between design and blueprint or design and blueprint mode. The blueprint mode is basically a less distracting design mode. In this video we will use the design mode. With this handle here at the bottom we can change the size of this editor, and we can also put it into landscape mode. I go ahead and reverse this. Here on this button we can toggle between showing constraints or not. And of course, to make changes, we want to see the constraints. And now let's take a look at these constraints. So we see these 4 circles here. When we click on them, we delete the constraint. When we click on these handles and hold the mouse button, we can drag it to an anchor point. Anchor points are the edges of other views or the parent layout. So when I drag this to the top of this parent layout, I can set this constraint. And the same for the right edge. And I only can set horizontal constraints to horizontal anchor points and the other way around. I can't drag this right handle to the top of this layout, for example, only to a vertical anchor point. One handle can set one constraint, but one anchor point can take multiple constraints. So you can drag the handles of multiple views to the same anchor point. This is no problem. But you can't set these anchor points to multiple edges. We also have this clear all constraints button here, which as the name implies removes all the constraints in this layout. And now when we take a look into the XML editor, we see these two attributes here, and they are just responsible for keeping this view in position in the editor. But now we have this warning here. This view is not constrained, it only has design time positions, so it will jump to 0, 0 unless you add constraints. And when we run this app now, we will see that this text view is actually in the top left corner now, because we didn't add any constraints. So these two attributes are only for the preview window. They don't have any effect in the actual app. And now when I take this bottom handle and align it with the bottom edge and restart the app, we now have a vertical constraint which drags it to the bottom, but we don't have a horizontal constraint. So it's still aligned on the left edge of the layout. So every view needs at least one vertical and one horizontal constraint. But as you can see, now this absolute Y attribute disappeared and we only have this absolute X left. Because as soon as we have constraints, these attributes here get deleted automatically. So if I drag this to the right edge, our absolute X disappeared as well. And we instead have these constraint bottom to bottom of and constraint end to end of attributes, together with these margins. And if you look closely, you can see the margins at the bottom and the right side of this text view. When I increase them, we now have more room to the edges. Okay, back into the design tab. Now when we remove these constraints here, another interesting button is this one here, Infer Constraints. When we click this, it automatically sets constraints to keep the view where we set it before. This will also respect constraints that you already set before, but in most cases you still have to make some slight adjustments. So this button is usually good to finish your layout when you already set most constraints and just want to make sure that everything is constrained properly. Now let's put this text view into the middle and give it constraints. And when we have constraints on two sides, it will be centered in the middle by default. But if we drag this bar here, we can change the bias. So at the moment this is at 50, which means 50%. If we drag this, we can move it to the left or the right, and the same for top and bottom, of course. This percentage will also be applied if you set it to a bigger screen. Here we have some more attributes, like the text, for example, content description. When we click this button, we can show the other attributes that are available. With this button here, we get back to the previous view. And now up here, this is another interesting part. At the moment, our text view is set to wrap content into width and height, which is represented by this shape here. When we click on this, we can change it to a fixed size, for example. Now this is set to a 70-60p, but we can also change this, for example, to a 100 dp. This way we hardcode the size. We can also change this to a match constraints, and this is pretty similar to match parent, which is not available for constraint layout, but it will respect constraints. So when I add a margin here, which we can do with this button, for example 16, and let's set it on this side here as well, and now it will only fill the width until it matches these constraints. We can also change the fixed size by dragging these square handles here on the corners, like this. And as you can see, this as well sets a fixed size to our text view. So I already showed you how you can change the margin of the view. And here you can set a default margin. At the moment this is set to 8. We can, for example, change it to 24, but this will only be applied to views we add into our layout from now on. So it's not automatically applied to our text view, which is already in the layout. So when I now drag this button and give it some constraints, it has this 24 dp margin. And these margins are all a multiple of 8 because of the material design guidelines. Now when I remove this button, we also have another very interesting button, this one here, turn on auto connect. This is disabled by default. When we click on it, we can enable it. And now when we drag another button into this layout, it automatically gets constraints applied to it. But as you can see, it only constrained it horizontally and not vertically. And it also only seems to work if we put it somewhere into the middle. And it also only constrains the view to the parent and not to other views. So this is probably not the most useful feature. However, when we select this button, remove the constraints, and now go here and click this button instead, it centered our button in relation to this texture which is already existing. We can also align it with the parent by clicking the other icon here, which has this square around it, and now it aligns this with the parent. When we select both views, we now have some more options here. And if you hover over them, you can basically read what they do. Align right edges, which does this. It aligns these two views on the right side. The same on the left. We can center them horizontally and vertically. And we can align the baselines, but we will take a look at this in the next videos. And the same as we set our constraints on the parent, we can also set them relative to each other. I can take this and drag it to the bottom here. We have our 24 margin. We can change the margin. We can move it around. We can align it on each other horizontally. We can align it with the parent. We can basically do anything. And when I remove these constraints again, and let's put some other views into here, like this. And when we now click Info Constraints, you will see that it adds constraints for all these views, which Android Studio thinks are the appropriate ones to get our desired layout. So this is a really good help if you want to get started with constraint layout. Okay, those weren't all features of constraint layout, there are still a lot more interesting ones, and we will take a look at them in the next videos. Until then, I would encourage you to play around with this constraint layout because it's really fun in my opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to not miss the upcoming constraint layout videos. Take care.
Okay, let me go back here. Anyway, I thought that was a very decent video. There's actually 4 of them in the series. Probably the first 3 are relevant to at least stuff I'm going to cover today. But if you have some time, go ahead and watch them. They're pretty entertaining. All right, so more things. Baseline alignment. So keep in mind that text is not always the same size. So when you align things, sometimes you want to align. Let's see if I have an example. We'll come up with an example here. Sometimes you want to kind of align with the baseline of the text. So let's see. So I have some plain text here. And let me put another text element here. And this second one, let's see if I can change the font size somehow. That's probably in the expanded. EMS, is that probably what I think it is? Maybe not. How do you define text size? Text, 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 text. Text caps, text color, text size. Let's see. So it's 18 spaces. Okay, there we go. So let's see, I have this guy here, and how do I align? There's got to be a way to align. Oh, there it is. Okay. So what I want to say here is this. Okay, so now I have this line here, and I can align that to here. So there's a little button here that says AB with a dotted line underneath it. So once you click that, then you get this special bar here, and then you can align the text on the baseline there. Kind of useful if you're dealing with text of different sizes. Edit baseline, little AB underneath it. Guidelines, I think I showed those. They're just sort of these lines that appear when you're editing but not in the final product, and they're kind of good to kind of, you know, define some center points or lines that you sort of want to use for alignment but not really display in any purpose. So here in this case we have a line that's 192 units from the left side, and we can use this line when we're starting to define our constraints. So vertical or horizontal guidelines, you can constrain views. A guideline is going to be invisible to the app user. You can position the guideline within the layout based on either DP units or percentage relative to the layout's edge. So what you do is you sort of drag the dotted line to reposition it, then click on the circle at the top. Now we had trouble clicking, it seemed to go away, but let's try that one more time. So if I go to here and add a vertical guideline, I got it, select it, I can move it. There, now it works. So let's see. Okay, so here it's cycling. So 90 pixel or 90 units from the left, 294 from the right, or a percentage. And that's great, but oh, there we go. Okay, so now it's working. Maybe it just didn't work in the design view. Now it's behaving okay. Okay, so that's how you create a guideline. And what you can do here is, now I can break this guy. Let's see. So there's no constraint here. I can constrain it to this line here. Now it's constrained. If I got rid of this guy, you'd see it. Let's go ahead and delete this guy. Back here, so now we have this name, and it's sort of constrained on the guideline here. If I move the guideline, it's going to constrain with it. Cool. Okay. Measurements left, right, percentage. Barrier. This is a little more difficult. It's similar guidelines, but defined by a group of views. So you create a barrier. Let's do a horizontal barrier. Got it. And then what you want to do is drag controls in there. So here I'm going to drag this guy in. I only have a barrier with one control. What does it say? It probably doesn't like the fact that my edit's not fully constrained. Let's see, constrain there, edit. I'm going to go ahead and remove this constraint right here. Okay, this constraint, not constrained vertically. At runtime, it's going to jump to the top. Why is it going to jump to the top? I don't know. So these barriers are sort of shown with this gradient look right here. And I'm not sure why I'm getting that error message, but basically here, this is sort of a reference. It's not really a hierarchy, but just sort of this barrier is defined by all the controls underneath it. So if I created a second plain text, put it up here, then constrain this guy a little bit. And then I added this new one. Oh wait, that was edit 3. So let me add it here to the barrier. So now my barrier has 2. It's going to be confusing here. So let's take this guy, and I'm going to go ahead and remove that constraint, move him up here. But this barrier should be the top side. Can I change the barrier direction? Let's see. My barrier is selected. Barrier direction top. Let's do it on the right. Okay, so there's my barrier there. So it's going to take the rightmost edge of everything underneath it and use that sort of as a constraint. So my button here, I can constrain that to my barrier, I think. Let's go ahead and bring this down a little bit. Constrain that, constrain, yeah. So that with the margin and everything. So kind of what I want to do, so let's go back to this edit here. If I resize this guy here, here's the one that's defining it at the moment. So if I move this in, then my barrier is going to move, and this guy's still going to be constrained to it. So anyway, it's a little more confusing, but it is kind of one of these lines that are defined by everything that's underneath it, and the barrier is saying that the direction's right. So everything, the rightmost part of any view underneath it defines what that barrier is. Chains, this is more advanced. Chains are a group of views that are linked together to each other with bidirectional positional constraints. The views within a chain can be distributed either vertically or horizontally. A picture's worth 1,000 words here. So we got a group of views, A, B, and C. They're linked together with bidirectional positional constraints. So these guys are sort of all linked together, and you define a chain. So if you notice here that in this case you have equal spacing on all sides, here equal spacing, but these are constrained to the left and right side. Here there's no space, it's all taken up by A, B, C, and here they're all kind of scrunched together and the extra space is sort of on the outside. So they call number one is spread. The views are evenly distributed after the margins are accounted for, and that's the default way of doing this. The spread inside, the first and last views are affixed to constraints on each end of the chain, and then the distance is kind of spread between the two. Weighted, you could assign some weights and say which controls or which views sort of take up the most amount of space. And packed, the views are packed together, margins accounted for. It's a little more advanced. I'm not sure exactly how to set up a chain, but there is a way of doing that. And the last is groups. With groups, you can largely group together certain views. So group in a constraint layout contains references. It's sort of similar to the areas that we defined. So in this case, what we're doing here, we're going to add a group. Here's my group. I'm going to say my group is going to be edit text 1 and edit text 3. So here, look at my group. I got 2 items in here. All it is sort of a way of kind of enabling and disabling. You can change the visibility of all views in a group just by setting the group's visibility without needing to set every view's visibility. So in other words, I got a group here. I can kind of give it a name, you know, my group of 2 edits. And then if you look at sort of your text, see how that looks in here. So here's a constraint view, and I give it an ID. So with this ID, what I can do is enable and disable it. And what that's going to do is, here's the referenced IDs. It's just a string of the text edits. So this guy is going to know when it's enabled. Then I'm going to enable these guys. If it's disabled, it's going to disable these guys. And here's an example of 2 constraints. And this kind of shows the group in here. How it's constrained, but I don't show any scripting code. But in scripting code, you can kind of get the ID, and then you know, if you know it's a group, you can kind of enable or disable. And again, you know, design editor, as you're going forth, you have this easy toggle here to go to design or go to text. So you know, hopefully you're doing most of your work in design, but you know, you sometimes have to roll up your sleeves and get in here and do some tweaking. And that's it. That's kind of what I wanted to cover today. You know, next time we'll talk about screen pixel density, styles, and themes. Kind of getting a little bit, revealing a little bit more about Android and you know, some of the mysterious kind of DP and you know, how you deal with different densities of devices, and also the styles and themes to kind of better organize the way UIs are sort of colored. So that it's a little bit developing styles and themes to kind of save a lot of work on tweaking all the colors and properties that you can do with UI elements. So that's what's coming up. You know, send me emails if you know, you need some more time, or just kind of let me know where things are at. You know, do a stand up and give me some heads up on where things are at, and you know, hopefully people can catch up, and you know, we can finish out this class. Again, we got 2 weeks, and hopefully it's enough time to, you know, focus and get most of the coding done for the projects and also for your final project. But keep in touch. Let me know how you're doing, and you know, we'll be in touch. So I'll talk to you later.
Thank you.